Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. Welcome, Silmarillion heirs, I should say, to our third and final week discussing the tragedy of Túrin Turambar, son of Húrin and Morwen Elethwen. And if things so far have been brutal and bleak, and you know that they have, then the last act of the story is not going to come as a surprise on the one hand, and is going to fulfill all of your darkest imaginings on the other. We are also possibly, if we have time, although I think I'm looking at my slides and can already say with a certain measure of confidence that we're probably not going to get to this evening, going to push into the next chapter just so we can wrap up the story of Húrin and Morwen. We shall see how things progress. Glad Rebecca is joining me here in the chat. 2 Silmarillion podcasts in 1 week. What a gift. I know we average one a week, but you're right. This compression between Sunday night when I recorded the last session and now here we are on Thursday and I'm recording a whole other session, it feels very tight. It feels as though we're on some kind of accelerated schedule, as perhaps we should be if we have any hope at all of concluding the Silmarillion in less than 6 months. I realized is perhaps the wrong word, but it was put into context for me today that this is session 21, which means that we're a stone's throw away from having spent half a year covering the Silmarillion, and God knows we could have taken twice as much time to cover the same amount of ground. But tonight, come hell or high water, we are going to finish the story of Túrin Turambar. Last time, I'll just return here to my recap so I can bring you up to speed. Túrin was rescued from the orcs of Morgoth by Beleg Strongbow, who Túrin then murdered, of course, and by Gwyndor of Nargothrond, who didn't make it through the whole of last week's reading either. Túrin accidentally takes charge of Nargothrond, usurping the authority of King Orodreth, because he is, we must never forget, canonically the hottest man ever to live. Túrin is just the best looking dude in the entire history of Middle-earth. And I'm saying that somewhat facetiously. That is true. That is absolutely true. We're also going to spend just a moment tonight talking about what it is that makes Túrin so special and why that specialness doesn't always hit the page in terms of this particular version of the story. We'll get into that in just a few slides time. Túrin changes the military strategy of the Noldor of Nargothrond. He also inadvertently, it would seem, wins the heart of Finduilas, the daughter of Orodreth. He cleanses Beleriand of orcs, but it turns out that fame and secrecy kind of at odds, the one with the other, and Morgoth sends his forces out, including Glaurung, the first dragon in his starring role here in the Silmarillion. Nargothrond is destroyed. Túrin is ensorcelled by Glaurung, held in stasis as all of the prisoners taken from Nargothrond, including a wailing Finduilas, are led away. And all that time, Glaurung is convincing Túrin that his mother and sister in Dor Lomin need him, that they miss him, that they yearn for him, and that he should go hither with all haste, which is exactly where we left Túrin at the end of last week's reading. Before we get to this week's session, though, I have a question from Sean that I wanted to drop into the episode here because it is never going to be more apposite. It is never going to be more relevant than tonight. Sean writes with an enviable brevity and clarity here. I thought Smaug started the dragon horde trope, but Glaurung has his own in Nargothrond. Does this predate The Hobbit? Thank you, Sean, for the question. And there are really two questions here, I suppose, right? The first addresses the roots of the dragon horde trope. Dragons coiling themselves around mounds of minted gold coins seems to be the historical precedent here, or the mythological precedent, I should probably say. And then the other side of the question, whether Glaurung or Smaug comes first in Tolkien's imaginary. To tackle the first part of that first, the connection between dragons and gold, caves full of gold, sometimes burial mounds or barrows full of gold, is as old as dragons themselves. It is about 1,000 years older than the association of dragons with breathing fire, right? That is a relatively modern invention for the dragon archetype. But dragons and gold are inextricably linked back to the oldest myths of dragons that we have. In the ancient Greeks had their version of dragons and treasure. Of course, the golden apples of the Hesperides are guarded by a dragon, as is the golden fleece sought by Jason. The golden apples, in fact, are protected by Ladon the dragon, who is, like Glaurung, wingless. If you go and look at illustrations, drawings of Ladon the dragon, who protects the golden apples of the Hesperides, then you will find pictures very similar to depictions of Glaurung in Tolkien's imaginary. In 43 BCE, famed Roman statesman Cicero describes a buddy of Mark Antony as coiling around his treasure like a dragon. And it's not just limited to classical mythology, of course, though it is curiously prominent in both Greek and Roman and, you know, the composite Greco-Roman mythological structures. It's also there in Norse myth, in Anglo-Saxon myth, in Finnish myth, in Germanic myth. It's all across a very similar kind of conception of dragons and dragon hordes all across Europe and the Near East. Fafnir, of course, is perhaps the most famous in both the poetic and the prose Eddas in Norse myth. Fafnir is often credited as being the originating myth of dragons, as well as dragons and hordes of gold, though, of course, Fafnir comes along 1,000 years, 1,200 years after the first documented versions of these myths in other traditions. So treasure hoarding is this fundamentally draconic quality, and it's absolutely fair to say that Tolkien is aware of the standards of the form, right? He's aware of the way in which these tropes have been explored previously in the Greco-Roman tradition, in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, in the Norse tradition. He's familiar, of course, with the dragon in Beowulf, a very formative text for Tolkien, one of the most important. We mentioned the Finnish myths, which so inspired the creation of the story of Túrin Turambar specifically, which is kind of where Glaurung gets his prominence. I mentioned last week that Glaurung is distinct from many of the dragons that we associate with the Tolkien legendarium, to the extent that we really... There are very few dragons in Tolkien. Like, really, when you sit down and you distill it out, right? Compared to a modern fantasy writer, certainly compared to the pages of any one of the adventure source books for Dungeons and Dragons, there are very few dragons in the pages of Tolkien, but they all kind of draw from that Anglo-Saxon kind of tradition. They're drawing from the Norse tradition of dragons very, very fully. So, particularly the dragon in Beowulf, particularly Fafnir, we're getting some inspiration there directly. So Tolkien is aware of all of this stuff as a classicist, as a medievalist. He's aware of all of these stories, and he is compositing them together into his version of Glaurung, though anchoring Glaurung, of course, in his secondary creation, in his imagined world, as fully and as completely as any other element of his storytelling. In terms of the other half of Sean's question, it is fair to say that Glaurung predates Smaug by at least a decade. That seems absolutely certain. Let me call up here. I have a slide to share with you from an unexpected source, a source that I'm not sure that I've quoted from before. This is from Turambar and the Foa Loke, the first version of the story of Túrin Turambar published in the Book of Lost Tales, Part 2. So this is composed sometime between 1916 and 1920, probably late in 1918. And in this version, Tolkien gives us the story of Turambar, right, and Foa Loke, the dragon, the drake, the fire drake, which includes the attack on Nargothrond, then just the caverns of the Rhodothlim. Excuse me, I'm choking there on my first pass at some of these words. The Rhodothlim, by the dragon Glaurung, then called Glorund. This is the passage. Quote, "Thus was it that this Loke, for so did the Eldar name the worms of Melko, suffered the orcs to slay whom they would, and to gather whom they listed into a very great and very sorrowful throng of women, maids, and little children. But all the mighty treasure that they had brought from the rocky halls and heaped glistering in the sun before the doors, he coveted for himself, and forbade them set a finger on it, and they durst not withstand him, nor could they have done so, and they would." Pretty powerful, right? Just this Glorund, the precursor to Glaurung, setting his right of conquest and domination over the treasures of what will eventually be referred to as Nargothrond. So, as I say, it's thought that this passage is written in 1918. It's certainly written before 1920, which puts it an entire decade before Professor Tolkien writes that immortal line, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," almost 2 decades, in fact, before The Hobbit is published. So it is more than fair to say that Smaug is derivative of Glaurung, though it is, of course, much more fair to say that they are both derivative of this entire mythopoetic space, first created by the Anglo-Saxon, Norse, Germanic storytellers of the early and high Middle Ages, based, as so many of those myths are based, on myths of the classical period. Glorfin David's asking in the chat here, could this originate in birds like magpies that like to collect shiny objects? I have heard that speculation before. I don't know that there's any real mythological work that's been done in that space. I certainly haven't read any, but I like it as a point of speculation. Certainly, right? We have this idea. I think that we can, on the one hand, kind of draw that connection, draw that comparison. Yes, there are birds like magpies. We see this hoarding instinct in creatures in the wild to a certain extent, and then when we expand that out to encompass like a mythological scale, then certainly dragons and dragon hordes make a lot of intuitive kind of emotional sense. But there's also a sense in which mythological monsters as chosen to represent like a purified kind of sin, or let's not load that perhaps so morally, but an aspect of humanity, right? We take a singular aspect of humanity, and like we are writing a classic Star Trek episode, we expand that out to encompass the entirety of someone's being or something's being. In that case, we can draw comparisons to the ways in which, pride and wrath and power and domination attract wealth and the comforts of a successful life. I think it's interesting to track that kind of emotional aspect to the way that we bring ourselves to myth, right? And therefore populate myth with exaggerated versions of ourselves. So I think that both of these things, right? We've got this kind of, you're right, the magpie kind of gives us a reverse etiological inspiration for the kind of myths that we see with dragons and with other kind of monsters too, of course, with other kinds of, mythological beasts. But certainly I think that there is this idea that as we see in Glaurung, as we see in Smaug, as we see in the dragon from Beowulf, as we see from Fafnir, we're getting this kind of sense of when cruelty and intelligence are heightened and coupled with this capacity for greed and for envy and for desire, right? When we expand that out to a draconic scale, to this mythological draconic scale, then what we get is a dragon horde, right? The ultimate kind of manifestation of that power would be a mountain of gold coins and maybe a goblet here and maybe, some jewels scattered through it. But we're getting a very kind of Peter Jackson Hobbit prologue kind of Smaug dragon horde there. Yeah. So I wanted to, yes, that was the question. Thank you so much, Sean, for that question. I hope that answers your question. But yes, certainly looking at Glaurung as an antecedent of Smaug, I think is really interesting. I actually went back and I was looking today. I was looking today at Smaug in The Hobbit. I have been kind of not rereading The Hobbit with any kind of deep care, but kind of skimming it and feeling the geography of the Silmarillion under the story of The Hobbit. And it is absolutely fascinating to read it in that light. I've never read it in that light. I don't think I've ever gone straight from the Silmarillion to The Hobbit in terms of my constant rotation of Tolkien books, which I think we all as Tolkien fans have. I don't think I've ever made that jump directly, and certainly not contiguously. So it's absolutely fascinating to return to the pages of The Hobbit and to see Tolkien's sense of this entire legendarium filtered through Bilbo's sense of this entire legendarium, filtered through Bilbo's act of ultimately, I suppose, tertiary creation, right? That he is creating a fictional world within the fictional world into which he is going to tell the story or from which he is going to draw the story of The Hobbit. It's absolutely fascinating, and perhaps we will have the opportunity to undertake that journey together in the near future, he said, gesturing ominously to a box labeled Brand New Podcast, which is just out of sight. Let's then get into our reading for tonight, shall we? And see what we can do with finishing up the story of Túrin Turambar. So this is after Túrin has dashed all the way to Dorloman. He is fatigued. He is still, as I noted at the end of last week's reading, under the influence of Glaurung. That spell has not abated. We're going to see in this chapter, in fact, when that spell breaks and the violence that flows from that moment. Thus he came hardly by the passes of Dorloman, through bitter snows from the north, and found again the land of his childhood. Bare and bleak it was, and Morwen was gone. Her house stood empty, broken and cold, and no living thing dwelt nigh. Therefore Túrin departed, and came to the house of Brotha the Easterling, he that had to wife Erin, Húrin's kinswoman. And there he learned of an old servant that Morwen was long gone, for she had fled with Nienor out of Dorloman. None but Erin knew where. Then Túrin strode to Brotha's table, and seizing him, he drew his sword and demanded that he be told whither Morwen had gone. And Erin declared to him that she went to Doriath to seek her son. For the lands were freed then from evil, she said, by the black sword of the south, who now has fallen, they say. Then Túrin's eyes were opened, and the last threads of Glaurung's spell were loosened, for anguish and for wrath at the lies that had deluded him, and hatred of the oppressors of Morwen, a black rage seized him, and he slew Brotha in his hall and other Easterlings that were his guests. Thereafter he fled out into the winter, a hunted man. But he was aided by some that remained of Hador's people and knew the ways of the wild, and with them he escaped through the falling snow and came to an outlaw's refuge in the southern mountains of Dorloman. Thence Túrin passed again from the land of his childhood and returned to Sirian's Vale. his heart was bitter. For to Dorloman he had brought only greater woe upon the remnant of his people, but they were glad of his going. And this comfort alone he had, that by the prowess of the black sword the ways to Doriath had been laid open to Morwen. And he said in his thought, then those deeds wrought not evil to all, and where else might I have better bestowed my kin, even had I come sooner? For if the girdle of Melian be broken, then the last hope is ended. Nay, it is better indeed as things be, for a shadow I cast wheresoever I come. Let Melian keep them, and I will leave them in peace unshadowed for a while. So much to cover here, right, as we move up here into Dorloman, the land of Túrin's youth. So we'll remember this account that through Túrin's success and his, what is the right word, militarization, weaponization of the Noldor of Nargothrond, they do cleanse Beleriand, the Vale of Sirion in particular, of orcs who had been hanging out there since, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears had been hanging out there this whole time, because with the Siege of Angband broken during the Dagor Bragollach, there was no further force necessary, or no further force possible, to stop the incursions of Morgoth's orcs. So that is the moment, that is the circumstance that allows Morwen and Nienor to flee Dorloman and to come all the way down into Doriath, into Menegroth, to the court of King Thingol and Queen Melian, where they expect to find their son and brother, respectively, and of course don't, because, well, of the long, sorry story that we've been telling. So Túrin is in this odd spot where his actions have won the freedom for his mother and sister, because he now sincerely believes that they're hanging out with Melian in what is probably the best place in Beleriand, and by extension, probably the best place in the world, right? Gondolin, sure. I mean, if you like that kind of thing, right? Living with Círdan, with the remnant of the Falas down at the mouths of the Sirion, down by the Bay of Balar, sure, okay, probably not so bad. Hanging out with the Green Elves over in Assyrian by the Seven Rivers, yeah, I mean, pretty good if you like that kind of thing. But honestly, Doriath is where it's at, right? So he's happy that his sister and mother are there. And moreover, so happy is he that he's justifying the entire misadventure in the first place. His heart was bitter, for to Dorloman he had brought only greater woe upon the remnant of his people, right? So let's tag that first. He shows up, goes to his mother's house. His mother's house, is empty because Morwen has gone to Doriath. So he goes instead to the home of Brotha. Brotha, the Easterling, was introduced at the beginning of this chapter. He is one of the Easterlings that is granted Dorloman, in effect, after the Nirnaeth Arnodiad, right? You'll remember that Morgoth promises the Easterlings initially that they can have the rich, lush pastures of Beleriand all to themselves, but then after they're victorious in the battle, he refuses that request and banishes them to Hithlum, banishes them to Dorloman, a difficult place to live in the best of times. So Brotha is there, but is not an ally. He is not of the people of Dorloman in the same way as Túrin is. And as we see here, Túrin takes his vengeance. But the why here is so interesting, right? He goes to Brotha's table, seizing him, he drew his sword and demanded that he be told whither Morwen had gone. And Iron declared to him that she went south to Doriath to seek her son, for the lands were freed from evil by the black sword of the south, who now has fallen, they say, right? You'll remember that that Túrin's fame as the black sword spread, but wasn't ever really matched with his real name. Then Túrin's eyes were opened. So this is the moment when Glaurung's spell breaks. Everything up to this point, and I emphasize this because we're going to be considering his interactions with Findulis. We're going to be considering how he is weighing and how he is prioritizing this one quest over the other, the rescue of his mother and sister, implanted in his mind by Glaurung, over the kind of more morally immediate rescue of Findulis, who he hears being taken from the wreck of Nargothrond. So in this moment, Túrin's eyes are opened, the last threads of Glaurung's spells are loosed, and for anguish, and for wrath at the lies that had deluded him, and hatred of the oppressors of Morwen, a black rage seized him. So, because he is in this moment tormented, because he is in this moment furious, wrathful at the lies that had deluded him, not Brotha's lies here, not the lies of the Easterlings in this moment, but Glaurung's lies, right? This is an act of vengeance from Túrin Turambar, and hatred of the oppressors of Morwen. So there is an element here, like a defense here of his mother in the first place. A black rage seized him and he slew Brotha in his hall and other Easterlings that were his guests. And of course, we're playing into here Anglo-Saxon traditions of the hearth, the position of the guest, right? As you are welcomed into someone's home, the spurning of that welcome, the spurning of that invitation, the spurning of that hospitality, particularly the staining of that hospitality with violence, is one of the most egregious and reprehensible things a person can do. If you're a fan of Game of Thrones, of course, you'll be thinking of certain weddings and how things go down. So thereafter, he flees out into the winter, a hunted man, and he's aided by some that remain of Hador's people who knew the ways of the wild. So that's great. So he shoots off again out of Dor-lómin all the way back down into Cirian's Vale. And the unasked directly, but definitely prompted question is, so what happens to the other people who are still living in Dor-lómin? What happens to the other of the House of Hador who remain in Dor-lómin after Brotha is slain, after the guests of Brotha are slain by Túrin Turambar, who sweeps into town asking about Morwen and Nienor? So in this moment, as he flees back south, he does this act of justification, right? He explains away his own acts. He should be, perhaps, feeling a little culpability for the fall of Nargothrond, feeling as though perhaps his desire for pride, absolutely, you'll remember the message from Ulmo that we got warning Orodreth to seal the gates of Nargothrond, to, by implication, take down the brand spanking new bridge that they had constructed. Ulmo urges Nargothrond to seal up its doors and to hide and to cast its pride like stones into the river. It's the pride of Túrin that we're talking about there, and it's explicitly the pride of Túrin that prevents them from doing exactly that. So how does Túrin wrestle with his own culpability here, wrestle with his own responsibility for this? Well, if I hadn't done everything that I did, then the way to Doriath wouldn't have been laid open to Morwen. He said in his thought, then those deeds wrought not evil to all, and where else might I have better bestowed my kin, even had I come sooner? For the girdle of Melian be broken, then the last hope is ended. Oh, well, they're in the safest place they could possibly be. So I guess what I did, maybe not good, but definitely not bad, probably morally a wash. And that's hard to justify. It's hard to... It's going to set an expectation for the rest of this chapter, I think, that we are going to remain at such a distance from Túrin Turambar and the choices that he makes, that it is going to be actually difficult to ultimately reconcile ourselves with what this story is about, with what this story tells us, with what this story accomplishes, particularly alongside the story of Húrin, alongside the story of Beren, alongside the story of Tuor, which we'll get to in the pages to come. This is an odd one, and partly it's odd because of this emotional distance. Let's get further into it. I do have some answers on that, by the way. I'm not going to leave us just with with unresolved questions about why we tell the story of Túrin Turambar in the first place, but we must move forward before we get to those. So let's get then to, God, because the tragedies just keep coming. Let's get ultimately to the death of Finduilas. Now Túrin, coming down from the arid Wethrin, sought for Finduilas in vain, roaming the woods beneath the mountains, wild and wary as a beast, and he waylaid all the roads that went north to the pass of Cirian. But he was too late, for all the trails had grown cold or were washed away by the winter. Yet thus it was that passing southwards down Teiglen, Túrin came upon some of the men of Brethil that were surrounded by orcs, and he delivered them, for the orcs fled from Gurthang. He named himself Wild Man of the Woods, and they besought him to come and dwell with them. And he said that he had an errand yet unachieved, to seek Finduilas, Orodreth's daughter of Nargothrond. Then Dorlas, the leader of these woodsmen, told the grievous tidings of her death. For the men of Brethil had waylaid them at the crossing of Teiglen, in the orc host that led the captives of Nargothrond, hoping to rescue them. But the orcs had at once cruelly slain their prisoners, and Finduilas they pinned to a tree with a spear. So she died, saying at the last, "Tell the Mormagil that Finduilas is here." Therefore they had laid her in a mound near that place, and named it Houth en Eleth, the mound of the Elfmaid. I mean, is it worse that we don't witness the death of Finduilas firsthand? It has an inescapable frigidity to it, right? There is a coldness found in this moment of narrative, in this choice to distance us from the actual death of Finduilas, right? Everything here seems to be good. The men of Brethil, Dorlas, Dorlas leading the men of Brethil, come to the crossings of Teiglen. You'll remember that for ages past, for generations now, the men of Brethil have been commanded by Thingol to protect the crossings of Tyglen. That was like the condition of their residence in the Forest of Brethil in the first place. So they did their thing. They fall upon the orc host at the crossings of Tyglen, and the orcs slay the prisoners, including Findulis. And Findulis they pinned to a tree with a spear. I take this attributed line. So she died saying at the last, tell the Mormagil that Findulis is here. Tell the Black Sword that Findulis is here. Obviously, we're kind of leveraging the power of names here in this slide where Túrin gives himself possibly his least successful name so far. Wild Man of the Woods. Hi, bienvenue. I'm Wild Man of the Woods. You can call me Wild Man for short. It's kind of unconvincing. It's kind of incomplete. It lacks some of the poetry of his other names. And it's not even accurate at this point because he isn't right now a wild man of the woods. He is actually on a very active quest. He comes upon the men of Brethil being accosted by these orcs, and he slays the orcs, or slays as many of them as he can before the others flee from his black sword, from Gurthang, from Anglachel reforged. So he introduces himself as a wild man of the woods, but when we cut to the story of Findulis, we get a more active interrogation and interaction with these names. And what I take here, I mean, is it possible to read this as condemnation? Absolutely. Absolutely it is. I think you can read Findulis as rejecting in this last moment her love for Túrin, right? Her completely unreciprocated love for Túrin, such as it seems to be. And instead offering a critique, offering something, withering, offering a judgment here upon him. Tell the Mormagil that Findulis is here. Tell the Black Sword that this is what happened to me. If you find this dude who is responsible for all of this, who is responsible, yes, for clearing the orcs out of Beleriand, but also for the fall of Nargothrond, for the fall of one of the last bastions of elven power in Beleriand. If you find him, tell him that I am here, pinned to this tree by this spear. He should know what he did. And certainly, if you're inclined to read it that way, I can't reject that outright. I can't find a real conclusive repudiation of that. For me, it feels more specific. The use of her own name, right? Findulis. That not tell him that I am here, but that I am Findulis. We're reminded, of course, that Gwyndor used to refer to Findulis as Faelivrin, right? He had this cute nickname for her based on the falls of Ivrin up there at the top of the Narog, where Túrin was healed, and then we returned there to find that Glaurung had defiled it, had frozen it, and that Túrin could take no longer sustenance there, right? He couldn't drink there anymore. It feels as though Findulis is maybe making a claim to her own identity in that moment and protecting his, right? So, or maybe it's some combination of the two. Let me know what you guys think. And I know that I've just talked about Túrin taking on another name, but on the next slide, he takes on the name. He takes on the one that is associated most often with him. Let's get into that. Túrin bade them lead him thither, and there he fell down into a darkness of grief that was near death. Then Dorlas, by his black sword, the fame whereof he had come even to the deeps of Brethil, and by his quest of the king's daughter, knew that this wild man was indeed the Mormagil of Nargothrond, whom rumour said was the son of Húrin of Dorloman. Therefore the woodmen lifted him up and bore him away to their homes. Now those were set in a stockade upon a high place in the forest, Efel Brandir upon Amon Obel, for the people of Haleth were now dwindled by war, and Brandir, son of Handir, who ruled them, was a man of gentle mood, and lame also from childhood, and he trusted rather in secrecy than in deeds of war to save them from the power of the north. Therefore he feared the tidings that Dorlas brought, and when he beheld the face of Túrin as he lay on a bier, a cloud of foreboding lay on his heart. Nonetheless, being moved by his woe, he took him into his own house and tended him, for he had skill in healing. And with the beginning of spring, Túrin cast off his darkness and grew hale again. And he arose, and he thought that he would remain in Brethil hidden, and put his shadow behind him, forsaking the past. He took therefore a new name, Turambar, which in the high elven speech signified Master of Doom. And he besought the woodmen to forget that he was ever a stranger among them, or ever bore any other name. Nonetheless, he would not wholly leave deeds of war, for he could not endure that the orcs should come to the crossings of Tyglen, or draw nigh to Howth and Eleth, and he made that a place of dread for them, so they shunned it. But he laid his black sword by, and wielded rather the bow and the spear. So here we are, Túrin Turambar, Master of Doom. Turambar, as is referenced here, right, in the High Elven speech, Turambar is a Quenya name, not a Sindar name. You'll remember, of course, that Quenya became became somewhat unfashionable here in the lands of Beleriand following the edict of King Thingol when the Noldor returned from Valinor. So most of the words that we've been getting lately have been Sindarin, but this is not. The Sindarin version of this would be Turamarth, which would mean roughly the same thing. This is the only one of Túrin's names which is Quenya, other than arguably Túrin itself, right? There's some interesting confusion over the names of the early men of Beleriand, over the Edain, and whether or not their names come from the Mannish languages or whether they come from Quenya in the first place. So Túrin could mean in Quenya, victory of heart, like strong-willed of heart. So now Túrin is at Amon Obel, which you'll remember I mentioned in last week's reading. In fact, I called out in last week's reading, is the place that he is looking to when he is hanging out on Amon Ruth, right? His eyes are constantly drawn north to the forest of Brethil and to the peak of Amon Obel itself. Amon Obel here translates as the hill of the walled settlement or fortified hill. More specifically, he's at Ethel Brandir, the fence of Brandir, who was also introduced here, Brandir of the House of Halath. Brandir will be important through the rest of this reading, though for reasons which will become obvious in the very near future, not so important for the rest of the book. And perhaps the most fascinating thing that we see here is the recapitulation of what has gone before. So much of this is familiar, right? Here we are in Ethel Brandir. Brandir, son of Handir, who ruled them, was a man of gentle mood, lame also from childhood, and he trusted rather in secrecy than in deeds of war to save them from the power of the north. Oh, just like Nargothrond, right? Nonetheless, he is also a skilled healer. He had skill in healing, and with the beginning of spring, Túrin cast off his darkness and grew hale again. Oh, we're kind of getting elements here of Beleg Strongbow. And look what happens. But Túrin starts to take over again. We're getting the third version of this now. We had the version with the Garthor, right? With the wolves of the wild, the outlaws that Túrin basically took over, and then we had the version in Nargothrond, and now we have the version here with the people of Amon Obel, with the people of Ethel Brandir. We also see, I think, a little bit of wisdom here, that at least he is setting his black sword aside, right? And well, I say wisdom, God, this is the story of Túrin Turambar, so of course everything is more complicated than that. Is it wise for him to set aside his black sword? Is it wise for him to set aside the name Mormagil, the identity of Mormagil? Well, yes, on the one hand, but on the other, he's explicitly running from his fate, right? He is doing exactly what Gwyndor accused him of doing. His fate lies not in his name, but in himself. He would remain in Brethil hidden and put his shadow behind him, forsaking his past. He took, therefore, a new name. He besought the woodmen to forget that he was ever a stranger among them, or ever bore any other name. Just pretend I've been here the whole time, and I have a new name, and that means that my doom, my fate, will not find me here. And of course, he's wrong. But we will leave him here for just a little while as we cut out to, well, first of all, to Doriath. Now new tidings came to Doriath concerning Nargothrond, and for some that had escaped from the defeat and the sack, had survived the fell winter in the wild, came at last to Thingol seeking refuge. And the march wardens brought them to the king. And some said that all the enemy had withdrawn northwards, and others that Glaurung abode still in the halls of Felagund. And some said that Mormagil was slain, and others that he was cast under a spell by the dragon and dwelt there yet as one changed to stone. But all declared that it was known to many in Nargothrond ere the end that Mormagil was none other than Túrin, son of Húrin of Dorloman. Then Morwen was distraught, and refusing the counsel of Melian, she rode forth alone into the wild to seek her son, or some true tidings of him. Thingol therefore sent Mablung after her, with many hardy marchwards, to find her and guard her, and to learn what news they might. But Nienor was bidden to remain behind. Yet the fearlessness of her house was hers. And in an evil hour, in hope that Morwen would return when she saw that her daughter would go with her into peril, Nienor disguised herself as one of Thingol's people, and went with that ill-fated riding. So, after the fell winter, months now after the fall of Nargothrond, the last refugees, the last survivors make it all the way to Doriath. They come to the king's court, they tell him the stories. Well, they tell him various different stories, right? Some say that the enemy has retreated to the north. Some say that Glaurung still resides within the ruin, the rack of Nargothrond. Some say that Mormagil is slain. Others that he is turned to stone by the dragon, effectively. But the one thing that everyone is pretty sure of at this point is that Mormagil, the Black Sword of Beleriand, is in fact Túrin, son of Húrin. So Morwen rides out. And Nienor rides out after her. And this little beat here, but Nienor was bidden to remain behind, yet the fearlessness of her house was hers, and in an evil hour, in hope that Morwen would return, when she saw that her daughter would go with her into peril, Nienor disguised herself as one of Thingol's people. This idea that one of the that Nienor is perhaps riding out for Túrin, right? Is riding out to find what happened to her brother, whom she has never met, but really is trying to prove to her mother, hey, I am also brave. I am also of the house. I am also here with you. You know, I am of the house of Húrin. I am also my father's daughter, and I want a relationship with you. I want to be respected by you, esteemed by you. I want to be, I don't know, enough for you, I suppose. I find that very touching there. So we reset here to Doriath so that we can introduce the second strand of this last act of Túrin's story, in effect, and really start to tighten the bonds, right? We're really starting to close down this story, to draw the loops of fate tighter and tighter still around Túrin Turambar, of course, just increasing the ironic potential contained within that name. Let's get to the fate of Nienor. Not even the ultimate fate, but the first kind of breaking of Nienor here. They came upon Morwen by the banks of Sirion, and Mablung besought her to return to Menegroth, but she was fey and would not be persuaded. Then also the coming of Nienor was revealed, and despite Morwen's command, she would not go back. And Mablung perforce brought them to the hidden ferries at the Meres of Twilight, and they passed over Sirion. And after 3 days' journeying, they came to Amon Ether, the hill of spies, that long ago Felagund had caused to be raised with great labour a league before the doors of Nargothrond. There Mablung sent a guard of riders about Morwen and her daughter, and forbade them to go further. But he, seeing from the hill no sign of any enemy, went down with his scouts to the Narog as stealthily as they could go. But Glaurung was aware of all that they did, and he came forth in heat of wrath and lay into the river, and a vast vapour and foul reek went up, in which Mablung and his company were blinded and lost. Then Glaurung passed east over Narog. Seeing the onset of the dragon, the guards upon Amon Ether sought to lead Morwen and Nienor away and fly with them with all speed back eastwards, but the wind bore the blank mists upon them, and their horses were maddened by the dragon's stench and were ungovernable, and ran this way and that, so that some were dashed against trees and were slain, and others were borne far away. Thus the ladies were lost, and of Morwen indeed no sure tidings came ever to Doriath after. But Nienor, being thrown by her steed yet unhurt, made her way back to Amon Ether, there to await Mablung, and came thus above the reek into the sunlight. And looking westward, she stared straight into the eyes of Glaurung, whose head lay upon the hilltop. Tragedy, an absolute moment of ill fate, right? The doom that Morgoth promised Húrin and all his family manifest here too. We have, of course, again, some familiar beats here from Tolkien, right? There's something very familiar about Nienor posing as one of Mablung's riders here as they head west. There's something, too, about the mist coming upon them and blinding them, driving their horses mad in this moment, right? This moment of almost a supernatural catastrophe. We're leaning a lot on Éowyn here for some weird reason. That's the beat that we're bringing into the story at this point. But there is, I think, a curious specificity here. We're not done with Morwen. It's entirely, it's all too simple to believe that Morwen falls out of the story here. As I say, we're going to rediscover the fate of Morwen at the beginning of next week's chapter. Probably we're going to get there. Yeah, glad Rebecca's calling out here Éowyn. Yes, exactly. That's the typography of this sequence. I think we're getting some of that same influence, but the culmination of that is, of course, very different, is violently different. And this is all the more effective because we forestaged so beautifully what Glaurung did to Túrin. Túrin's still wearing his dwarven helm, of course, that he takes from the Vault of Nargothrond. So he's partly protected. He's partly capable of resisting Glaurung. And Nienor has no such power, as we're about to see here. Her will strove with him for a while, but he put forth his power, and having learned who she was, he constrained her to gaze into his eyes, and he laid a spell of utter darkness and forgetfulness upon her, so that she could remember nothing that had ever befallen her, nor her own name, nor the name of any other thing. And for many days she could neither hear, nor see, nor stir by her own will. Then Glaurung left her standing alone upon Amon Ether, and went back to Nargothrond. Now Mablung, who greatly daring had explored the halls of Felgund when Glaurung left them, fled from them at the approach of the dragon and returned to Amon Ether. The sun sank and night fell as he climbed the hill, and he found none there save Nienor, standing alone under the stars as an image of stone. No word she spoke or heard, but would follow if he took up her hand. Therefore in great grief he led her away, though it seemed to him vain, for they were both like to perish succourless in the wild. But they were found by 3 of Mablung's companions, and slowly they journeyed northward and eastward toward the fences of the land of Doriath beyond Sirion, and the guarded bridge nigh to the inflowing of Escalduin. Slowly the strength of Nienor returned as they drew nearer to Doriath, but still she could not speak or hear, and walked blindly as she was led. But even as they drew near the fences at last, she closed her staring eyes and would sleep, and they laid her down, and rested also, unheedfully, for they were utterly outworn. There they were assailed by an orc band, such as now roamed often as nigh the fences of Doriath as they dared. But Nienor in that hour recovered hearing and sight, and being awakened by the cries of the orcs, she sprang up in terror and fled ere they could come to her. So, I'm fascinated by the story of Mablung here. Mablung gets, kind of short shrift, I suppose, from this story. He has good intentions and later really bad news to deliver. But this idea of him exploring the ruin of Nargothrond while Glaurung is absent, that's a story that I'd really love to hear. That's a story that I would like in more depth, please and thank you. But obviously, what we're really focusing on here is the fate of Nienor and the sorceress removal, not just of her memory, right? We often think of this as an amnesiac plot. I kind of joked about that at the beginning of last week's episode, but it's not just an amnesiac plot. What is removed from Nienor here is more profound than that. It is, in essence, the most profound thing that you can do to a character in Tolkien's stories, because what she loses isn't just her memory, isn't just her connections to her immediate world, it is language itself. Everything is gone. She could remember nothing that had ever befallen her, nor her own name, nor the name of any other thing. She doesn't speak. She has to be taught to speak again in the pages to come. And I can't help but be moved by Tolkien's correlation of those two things, that identity and language are inextricably connected. Obviously, we've seen that before. We've seen that throughout the Legendarium, that language and identity are intertwined, but usually they're intertwined on a societal level, on a cultural level, sometimes on a racial level, for want of a better word there. But what we're seeing here is the individual connection to language, the individual connection to one's sense of self. So Nienor is stripped of all of that. He leaves her standing alone upon Amon Ethir and goes back to Nargothrond. Now, we have to, of course, ask what the purpose is here, and we're going to return to our discussion last week, our brief discussion about the errand that Glaurung had completed. What is he doing here? This isn't just a random act of malice, or it doesn't seem to be a random act of malice. And this is one of the ways, I don't want to jump too far ahead with this, but this is one of the ways in which the story of Túrin Turambar is different from the story of Beren and Luthien, for example, or the story of Tuor, because Morgoth is more actively present, is more actively and directly and singularly malevolent in this story than in those other stories. Beren is imprisoned by Sauron, yes, faces down Morgoth in the pits of Angband, yes, but his enmity with Morgoth, the clash and conflict between the two, is kind of abstracted, right? Why are they fighting? Well, because Beren's a good guy, and Sauron's a bad guy, and Morgoth's a bad guy, so they're going to find themselves on different sides of this war. But the enmity here is that much more specific and that much more powerful, that much more focused. This isn't just, I can't believe it's just an act of random malevolence here from Glaurung. Which leads to an interesting question about the end of this passage and what exactly happens in this moment. There they were assailed by an orc band. So, God, as if these guys have not gone through enough. There they are assailed by an orc band, such as now roamed often as nigh the fences of Doriath as they dared. But Nienor in that hour recovered hearing and sight, and being awakened by the cries of the orcs, she sprang up in terror and fled ere they could come to her. Why? What is happening here? What is the narrative justification? What is the deeper cause for Nienor regaining her senses and her, to some extent, autonomy in this exact moment? Is this a continuation of Glaurung's malevolence? Can we imagine Glaurung somewhere off in the shadows, kind of just tweaking the spell just a little bit right in that moment to allow for the escape of Nienor and the ultimate ruin that will accompany her through the rest of this story? Or, I mean, we're thinking about the recovery of hearing and sight. We've been thinking about winds from the west in the last couple of chapters. We've been thinking about the degree to which the Valar are still present in the lives of the residents of Beleriand. And when I think of hearing and sight, of course, I think of Manwë and Varda. I think of Manwë and Varda upon Taniquetil, looking out upon the world in much the same way as Húrin right now, above Angband, is looking out across the world, is being superpowered by Morgoth's senses to see and hear all that transpires in the lives of his cursed family. Is this a moment of further torment, of further cruelty, of further malevolence on the part of Morgoth, on the part of Glaurung? Is this a moment of redemption by Manwë and Varda? Are they trying to provide a moment of hope here for Nienor? Is this a moment of eucatastrophe? Is this just the intervention of the fundamental goodness of the universe in this moment of direst need? Well, you'd have to go a pretty long way to justify the explanation of eucatastrophe. Although, well, no, we will get to that at the end of tonight's reading. We must accelerate just a little bit here because, yeah, as Gladrebecki says here in the chat, it's personal. It absolutely is. It is personal against Húrin and the Children of Húrin, thus the name of the story, right? It is personal against Húrin and the Children of Húrin in a way that it just isn't with Beren, in a way that it just isn't with basically anyone else. Does Morgoth hate Feanor? Absolutely, Morgoth hates Feanor, but even then it's kind of impersonal. They are part of a different kind of story. Now we are deep in this Anglo-Saxon saga. Now we are deep in this more ground level story where we have, for example, far fewer characters, right? We don't have the same scale of the Nirnaeth Arnodiad. We have fewer operative characters. We have fewer moving parts, and every single relationship is personally, emotionally, passionately charged. Let's keep going on here. Then the orcs gave chase, and the elves after, and they overtook the orcs and slew them ere they could harm her, but Nienor escaped them. For she fled as in a madness of fear, swifter than a deer, and tore off all her clothing as she ran until she was naked, and she passed out of their sight, running northward, and though they sought her long, they found her not, nor any trace of her. And at last Mablung in despair returned to Menegroth and told the tidings. Then Thingol and Melian were filled with grief, but Mablung went forth and sought long in vain for tidings of Morwen and Nienor. But Nienor ran on into the woods until she was spent, and then fell and slept and awoke, and it was a sunlit morning. And she rejoiced in light as it were a new thing, and all things else that she saw seemed new and strange, for she had no names for them. Nothing did she remember save a darkness that lay behind her and a shadow of fear. Therefore she went warily as a hunted beast, and became famished, for she had no food and knew not how to seek it. But coming at last to the crossings of Teiglin, she passed over, seeking the shelter of the great trees of Brethil, for she was afraid, and it seemed to her that the darkness was overtaking her again, from which she had fled. Mablung just really getting it done as a March Warden of King Thingol here. I had never thought of this comparison until this reading, but there's we're so often used to these moments of familiarity as we read Tolkien, right? These little echoes, these little points of symmetry and reflection, and sometimes contrast as we move through these stories. These the mythic, legendary elements being arrayed in different combination as we move through the whole span of the history of Middle-earth. But this is a really curious one because obviously there's a practical reason, right? Obviously we have to justify why no one knows who Nienor is when she is, spoilers, found by Túrin's people, right? So we strip off her clothing, right? She cannot be identified as a resident of Doriath, for example. We can assume that she is wearing still the riding gear that she wears to hide her identity when she's riding out with Mablung. But she can't be wearing that because we cannot know where she comes from. So she's stripped of her clothing as she runs through the forest, which it's a little difficult to maybe parse completely. In a different kind of story, it would be much more lascivious. But here, at least, it is fairly chaste. Galadriel Becky's jumped entirely to it right here in the chat. Oh my goodness, I never connected Nienor to the guy taunting Túrin about the women of his land. Yes, it's Cyros, right? You remember back in Menegroth, he's the guy who was teasing Túrin about whether the women of his people run naked in the forests with their hair streaming. And of course, that's exactly what Nienor is doing. So now we're getting this extra twist of tragedy to the story of Cyros and the departure of Túrin from Menegroth under quite a cloud. Isn't that a wild point of comparison, Becky? I'm so glad you jumped to that right before I go there. That's wonderful. Yes. So that moment of odd synchronicity, odd familiarity aside, we're getting into now a return of something very special, I think. And again, we're seeing just how important Professor Tolkien thinks that language is, how important language is in all of his writings, because bereft of language, bereft of the name of things, she is restored to this capacity for awe, right? The restoration being one of the great virtues of fairy stories, per Professor Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, right? One of the things that fantasy fiction can do is restore in us a sense of awe, a sense of terror, a sense of novelty that we have lost because we are jaded adults who live in the world. And what has happened here to Nienor is that she has also been restored. Having lost her language, everything now is new. Because she cannot put a name to the thing or describe the thing, it is completely unknown to her. She has no memory of it that as exists distinct from language. The language and the ability to name the thing is the entirety of the memory. So we get this babe in the woods, this new spirit in the forests of Beleriand who is apprehending these things for the first time. It was a sunlit morning and she rejoiced in light as it were a new thing, and all things else that she saw seemed new and strange, for she had no names for them. All she remembers is this darkness, is this fear. And it's interesting here too that we're getting her fleeing into the forests to shelter from the darkness, because we've done this back and forth with darkness and light before, right? We have Eol the Dark Elf living in the shrouded forests because he doesn't care for the sun. So the light and the darkness have continued to evolve in their complexity here. Now she is fleeing from the darkness that is behind her out of the direct sunlight that she is enjoying right now in this springtime morning. The winter has passed, remember, so this is a springtime morning in Beleriand. She has the bright sunlight and she flees from it into the shadows beneath the trees, because that is safer than the bright light when the darkness is coming toward her. Yes. Good. Let's keep going. We've still got so much to cover. But it was a great storm of thunder that came up from the south, and in terror she cast herself down upon the mound of Howth en Eleth, stopping her ears from the thunder, but the rain smote her and drenched her, and she lay like a wild beast that is dying. There Turambar found her, as he came to the crossings of Tigling, having heard rumour of orcs that roamed near, and seeing in a flare of lightning the body as it seemed of a slain maiden lying upon the mound of Findulis, he was stricken to the heart. But the woodman lifted her up, and Turambar cast his cloak about her, and they took her to a lodge nearby, and warmed her, and gave her food. And as soon as she looked upon Turambar, she was comforted, for it seemed to her that she had found at last something she had sought in her darkness, and she would not be parted from him. But when he asked her concerning her name and her kin and her misadventure, then she became troubled as a child that perceives that something is demanded but cannot understand what it may be, and she wept. Therefore Turambar said, "Do not be troubled. The tale shall wait, but I will give you a name, and I will call you Ninial, Tear Maiden." And at that name she shook her head, but said, "Ninial." That was the first word she spoke after her darkness, and it remained her name among the woodsmen ever since. On the next day they bore her toward Ethelbrandir, and when they came to Dimros, to the rainy stair where the tumbling stream of Celebros fell toward Tiglan, a great shuddering came upon her, wherefore afterwards that place was called Nen Gidith, the shuddering of water. Ere she came to the home of the woodman upon Amon Obel, she was sick of a fever, and long she lay thus, tended by the women of Brethil, and they taught her language as to an infant. But ere the autumn came by the skill of Brandir, she was healed of her sickness, and she could speak. But nothing did she remember of the time before she was found by Turambar on the mound of Howth en Eleth. And Brandir loved her, but all her heart was given to Turambar. Again, the symmetries are stacking up here, aren't they? We begin here, of course. I mean, the coincidence, the chance, if chance you call it, of her arriving at the Howth en Eleth, at the mound of the Elf Maiden here. worried, fearful of the thunder falling upon the mound itself. And Turambar finding her here, seeing her illuminated in a flare of lightning, exactly the same way as he found Beleg standing over him after Beleg had rescued him from the orcs up in Anfalglith. He thereafter slayed Beleg. Thankfully, he doesn't have the same instinct here for the woman who he is now going to refer to as Niniel, Tear Maiden. Not distinct entirely from her name, of course. Nienor, of course, meaning mourning, as we discussed before. It's an apposite name for sure. But Niniel, Tear Maiden. So he takes her home. She has this moment of sickening, of crisis of a sort, right? A great shuddering came upon her, wherefore afterwards that place was called Nan Girith, the Shuddering Water. But what happens? Well, she is healed. She is taught language. We have again, right, the skill of Brandir healing her of her sickness. She passes through it in a sense, which is the element that makes me think that perhaps the greater plan here is not Glaurung's. That perhaps we're supposed to read this as, I mean, it could be a natural sickness caused by her running through a thunderstorm naked, not good for the constitution, particularly after being robbed of one's entire identity, for sure. But I wonder if there's a magical consequence here too, that Glaurung had intended her to fall sick at this point, or just ultimately to die, that he had taken from her that which defines her and then sent her off to die, which raises some really interesting questions about what would have happened to Nienor if she had died while being deprived of her sense of herself, her facility with language, questions that are far beyond the scope of this podcast to answer for sure. So again, we have another echo of the very familiar and very recent past here, because here we position Niniel, as is now, in the position of Findulas, right? Brandir, who has tended to this young woman all through the spring, loves her, but her heart was given to Turambar. Once again, apparently through no action of Túrin himself, right? It doesn't seem as though anything good here. I'm so bewildered by the naming here. Because we put such an emphasis on the namings. Yes, the plural experiences of naming that we've encountered all the way through the Túrin story. There is a poetry to him naming her, but also it is, from a more objective perspective, nuts, right? This is just to quote the great Anglo-Saxon skald Carly Rae Jepsen. This is a real, hey, I just met you and this is crazy, but I'm going to give you a new name based on the fact that you're crying. That seems fine. Let's move on then. Back to Glaurung now. In that time the woodsmen were not troubled by the orcs, and Turambar went not to war, and there was peace in Brethil. His heart turned to Niniel, and he asked her in marriage. But for the time she delayed in spite of her love, for Brandir foreboded he knew not what, and sought to restrain her, rather for her sake than his own, or rivalry with Turambar. And he revealed to her that Turambar was Túrin, son of Húrin. And though she knew not the name, a shadow fell upon her mind. But when 3 years were passed since the sack of Nargothrond, Turambar asked Niniel again, and vowed that now he would wed her, or else go back to war in the wild. And Niniel took him with joy, and they were wedded at the midsummer, and the woodmen of Brethil made a great feast. But ere the end of the year, Glaurung sent orcs of his dominion against Brethil, and Turambar sat at home deedless, for he had promised to Niniel that he would go to battle only if their homes were assailed. But the woodmen were worsted, and Dorlas upbraided him that he would not aid the people that he had taken for his own. Then Turambar arose and brought forth again his black sword, and he gathered a great company of the men of Brethil, and they defeated the orcs utterly. But Glaurung heard tidings that the black sword was in Brethil, and he pondered what he heard, devising new evil. Again, more symmetry. Brandir telling Niniel about Túrin, and Gwyndor telling Findulas about Túrin, right? We're seeing exactly the same thing. And crucially, the same motivation here, we might infer. We get Gwyndor talking about his feelings more directly, but we get this account here that Brandir is acting in her best interest, or acting as best he can in her best interest. He seeks to restrain her rather for her sake than his own, or rivalry with Turambar, right? It's not that he wants her for himself, though he does, and it's not that he doesn't think that Túrin should be happy, though perhaps he doesn't, but he's telling Nienor this because he wants what is best for her, just as Gwyndor was giving what we took at the time to be very wise and selfless counsel to Findulas. And though she knew not the name, a shadow fell upon her mind. Well, of course it did. 3 years have passed. That takes us to 498 of the years of the sun. Túrin is 34, and Nienor is now 24. I'm not sure what to make of this this pact that we have here, right? 3 years had passed since the sack of Nargothrond. Turambar asked Niniel again and vowed that he would wed her or else go back to war in the wild. Those are your options, person who, or person with whom I have become close. Either you marry me and become my wife, or I guess I'm just going to go back to war. I guess I'm just going to go and fight some orcs again. And Niniel took him with joy, and they were wedded at midsummer. Oh, that's great. And what is the balance of that? Well, that he makes a promise not to go back to war unless in the direst need, right? Only if their homes were assailed. Unless Amon Obel is being attacked, then he's going to stay home with her. And I'm, again, right, we're so far away from this, and this is not the kind of story that we generally get from Professor Tolkien anyway, with one single solitary exception that I can think of. I would love to know the domestic drama here. I would love to know, did she extract this promise from him? Is this a decision that he has made? What is the domestic dynamic between husband and wife, between brother and sister here, as Turambar decides not to return to conflict? Though ultimately, Dorlas upbraids him, right? The woodmen were worsted. They're having a bad time. They cannot withstand the orcs sent forth by Glaurung from Nargothrond, or by Glaurung, who is in Nargothrond. Presumably the orcs are not in Nargothrond. I'm not sure that Glaurung would suffer the company of the orcs there. So the orcs come forth. The woodmen are suffering. And Dorlas tells Turambar that he needs to go forth, and he does. He takes out, again, the black sword, the bow and spear, insufficient at this point, I guess. And of course, that reveals him. Again, we're back to this. Again, we're back to his fame spreading. So, I was going to pause here, but I think this actually, you know what? Let's do one more. Let's do one more slide, and then I want to talk a little about, then I want to kind of change gears and talk about what makes Túrin so good, right? If you're tired of me slamming on Túrin through this whole reading and the preceding two readings, stick around, because I'm going to have some words of well, maybe not praise, but at least some words of consideration for Túrin in just a moment. In the spring of the year after Niniel conceived, and she became, in the spring of the year after Niniel conceived, and she became wan and sad. And at the same time, there came to Ethelbrandir the first rumors that Glaurung had issued from Nargothrond. Then Turambar sent out scouts far afield, for now he ordered things as he would, and few gave heed to Brandir. As it drew near to summer, Glaurung came to the borders of Brethil, and lay near the west shores of Teiglin, and then there was a great fear among the woodfolk, for it was now plain that the great worm would assail them and ravage their land, and not pass by, returning to Angband as they had hoped. They sought therefore the counsel of Turambar, and he counselled them that it was vain to go against Glaurung with all their force, for only by cunning and good fortune could they defeat him. He offered therefore himself to seek the dragon on the borders of the land, and bade the rest of the people to remain at Ethelbrandir and to prepare for flight. For if Glaurung had the victory, he would come first to the woodsmen's homes to destroy them, and they could not hope to withstand him. But if they then scattered far and wide, then many might escape, for Glaurung would not take up his dwelling in Brethil, and would return soon to Nargothrond. Then Turambar asked for companions willing to aid him in his peril, and Dorlas stood forth, but no others. Therefore Dorlas upbraided the people and spoke scorn of Brandir, who would not play the part of the heir of the house of Haleth, but Brandir was shamed before his people and was bitter at heart. But Hunthor, kinsman of Brandir, asked his leave to go in his stead. Then Turambar said farewell to Niniel, and she was filled with fear and foreboding, and their parting was sorrowful. But Turambar set out with his two companions and went to Nen Girith. Casually thrown out here at the beginning, of course, Niniel is now pregnant, as one might expect a new bride to be when we are pursuing these medieval social hierarchies, for sure. We'll see again, too, Turambar taking over completely, right? We've been kind of moving toward this the entire time that he's been at Amon Obel, the entire time that he's been at Ethelbrandir, excuse me. We see again this natural assumption of authority, this natural movement toward the top of the social hierarchy. We saw it with the outlaws, we saw it back in Nargothrond, and now here we're seeing it again. Though crucially here, you'll note we're in a very different register, right? We understand that if Glaurung comes against Ethelbrandir, he's going to ravage it, he's going to destroy it, but he's not going to hang around because this place is no Nargothrond, right? He's going to go back to his caves. He's going to go back, crucially, to his hoard. So, as we look at this, I find it difficult to parse my understanding of Túrin Turambar as a hero, because unexpectedly, here in this passage, he's right. Unexpectedly, he's kind of doing the smart, heroic thing. He sends out the scouts. Right? Okay, so he's already back in the field as the Black Sword. He's already attracted the attention of the great worm Glaurung to this small encampment. But he's doing the smart thing. He sends out the scouts. They understand that Glaurung is here. They seek his counsel, and he says, "Don't fight him. You can't. That's crazy. What are you talking about? Nobody can stand against Glaurung. We need to be smart." And this is another way in which this story pivots back to the story of Fafnir. This is another way in which it pivots back to like a kind of a saga like Beowulf, because we're speaking about roguish heroes who rely on their wits and trickery more than, straightforward, stalwart heroes. Túrin in this part is absolutely of that prior form, right? So he heads off. I love Dorlas standing forth, but no others. Then Dorlas upbraided the people 2 slides in a row where Dorlas is upbraiding somebody. Dorlas just absolutely the moral compass of the people of Ethel Brandir here. And coming again at Brandir himself, who would not play the part of the heir of the House of Halath, but Brandir was shamed before his people and was bitter at heart, right? He's been usurped again by Túrin. And he can't go. He can't go and strive in the field with Túrin in this moment. But Hunthor, kinsman of Brandir, asked his leave to go in his stead. Got good feelings about this kid, Hunthor. I think he's really going to make it as long as he can survive, the next slide. So I wanted to pause here in this moment as Túrin is making what is, at least as far as we can tell, the smartest possible choice, right? Not a great choice, right? Not a perfect strategy here, but of the options available to him, maybe his best choice. Going alone, going with some trusted, or going basically alone, going with some trusted men, trying to take down the dragon the way that heroes in this sort of story take down dragons. And I want to talk about this because it is very easy, I think, to lose track of Túrin Turambar. Now that we're so deep in the mire here, now that he is actually married to his pregnant sister, now that we are actually deep in the tragedy and we can feel, I think, the threads of fate tightening around him like a noose at this point, it's hard sometimes to remember that Túrin is one of the greats, that Túrin is the star of the show when it comes to one of the most important stories, one of the 3 great stories of the early Legendarium. I wanted to switch out and show this slide. Hey, be ready for some nostalgia here, because this is a slide from The Lord of the Rings. "I will take the ring," he said, "though I do not know the way." Elrond raised his eyes and looked at him, and Frodo felt his heart pierced by the sudden keenness of the glance. "If I understand aright all that I have heard," he said, "I think that this task is appointed for you, Frodo, and that if you do not find a way, no one will. This is the hour of the Shire folk, when they arise from their quiet fields to shake the towers and councils of the great. Who of all the wise could have foreseen it? Or if they are wise, why should they expect to know it until the hour has struck? But it is a heavy burden, so heavy that none could lay it on another. I do not lay it on you. But if you take it freely, I will say that your choice is right. And though all the mighty elf friends of old, Hador and Húrin and Túrin and Beren himself were assembled together, your seat should be among them." This, of course, from the Council of Elrond, Book 2, Chapter 2 of The Lord of the Rings. It's worth noting, I suppose, as we mentioned this here, that Elrond never meets Túrin. Elrond is going to be born in about 30 years' time, down at the mouths of the Sirion by the Bay of Balar, where Círdan's folk have gone following the wreck of the Falas. Hador also maybe stands out here. Hador, golden-haired, you remember, was Húrin's grandfather. This is why we're getting them here presented in triplicate, I suppose, right? Hador, the grandfather, Húrin, the father, and Túrin, the son here. Hador was the one who was originally granted the realm of Dorloman in the northwest by Fingolfin. He's the one to whom Fingolfin gives the dragon helm of Dorloman that Túrin later wears. He dies protecting the rear of Fingolfin's forces during the Dagor Bragalach, the Battle of Sudden Flame that ends the siege of Angband. So, why Túrin? Why does Túrin make this list? Because quite frankly, if you're looking at this list with a kind of casual knowledge of the Silmarillion, I think it's fair to say that one of these names is not like the others, right? Hador, absolutely uncontested hero. And more than just a hero, a forger of a stronger alliance between the men and elves of Beleriand. Húrin, likewise, absolutely no question. Beren, one of the most important figures in terms of understanding how the younger and the older children of Iluvatar are supposed to live together, to be together, how they complement one another, right? Beren, an absolutely pivotal figure in that story. And then there's Túrin, a guy who makes a bunch of really tough mistakes, a guy who just kind of stumbles from catastrophe under the baleful glaze of Morgoth, absolutely, but like a different kind of character and a different kind of story. And I want to crucially note here that Elrond is, yes, noting elf friends, right? The mighty elf friends of old is what he says. So he is talking about people who are close to the elves, right? Elf friend here is like a formal title in this regard. He's talking about people who are close to the elves. He's talking about people who forge this new alliance. So we're thinking in part not of Túrin as an adult bouncing from catastrophe to catastrophe, but, you know, the years spent by Túrin in Thingol's court, the years spent where Túrin is essentially the fostered son of King Thingol. We're thinking of these moments of connection and these moments of unification. Unification is maybe too strong, but of deeper connection between the elves and the men of Beleriand. But we're also clearly talking about skill. We're also clearly talking about a kind of abstracted heroism, right? Because the other thing that these guys have in common is great deeds, capital G, capital D, Hador and Húrin and Túrin and Beren, right? And that's clearly the point that Elrond is making in the Council of Elrond. He's not saying to Frodo, you know, if you undertake this mission, I think you're going to be really good for the relationship between elves and men. No, he's talking about the magnitude of their accomplishments. He's talking about the magnitude of their heroism. And yes, Túrin is going to accomplish something genuinely fantastic. He's going to accomplish a great deed. It will be upon his, you know, epitaph, the great deed for which he is chiefly remembered, which is wild, frankly, but here we are nonetheless. So we must remember that Túrin is, capital G, great. That Túrin is of an order of heroes unique to this period of history. I think that is also a fair thing to kind of pull out and try to understand here, that as the elves of the Elder Days are greater than the elves of the Third Age, so the men of the Elder Days are orders of magnitude more capable, more great, more true, more heroic than the men that we get of later days, yes, even Aragorn. So Túrin is, even in the story as it's presented to us, heroic. This is why I think he ascends in the ranks wherever he goes. We're getting a kind of informed or implicit recognition of his virtue, recognition of his nobility, recognition, if we just kind of strip away the complex political situation in Beleriand right now, recognition of his kingship, excuse me. We're recognizing that he is, you know, the great man, that he is the great monarch. He is a king in the way that Aragorn is a king, even before he is actually crowned, right? This is Tolkien's kind of, I was going to say great man theory of history, but that's not exactly what I mean. But it is this idea that the great are kind of appointed and manifest a certain quality. And that is why Túrin is so often thrust into these positions, so often assumes these positions of authority, as I say, with the outlaws, in Nargothrond, kind of displacing, almost usurping Orodreth, and crucially, winning the love of Finduilas, right? That's not a coincidence. That is Finduilas responding intuitively to a greatness in their midst, right? And then the same thing unfolding here. It doesn't matter that Brandir loves Niniel, because she is going to be attracted to the greatest force around her, which is going to be, of course, Túrin. So as we move into the rest of the story, and as we consider the ways in which Túrin is a different hero, how do I want to phrase this? As we consider the ways in which Túrin is a different kind of hero than, for example, Beren, as we were discussing a little bit last week, I want to think a little bit about how our understanding of Túrin is informed by the shape of the story, by the tone of the story, by the style of this story, rather than Túrin being objectively different than Beren, in terms of his heroism, at least, right? In terms of his wisdom, it's not really a contest. In terms of his, you know, moral authority, again, not really a contest there. Kind of Túrin is, you know, a little further down the league than any of the other elf friends that we just named. But in terms of his might, in terms of his singular authority and agency in the world, right? This idea that violence is the tool of the state, and the state is the king. Right? It's a very simple kind of direct kind of application of social power here, social pressure, social violence, I suppose, in a way. The medieval worldview has a very simple kind of 1 to 2 kind of process for that, and it's the king has a sword, and that sword will hit you, and it will hurt because the king is mighty, the king is great. So I want to bear that in mind as we move forward here through the rest of Túrin's story, and now I have to accelerate because otherwise we're never going to make it through the rest of Túrin's story, and that would be terrible. So here we are. Yeah, of course, because I just mentioned it before I got distracted. You know what's interesting? Actually, I should just mention this. The other time that Túrin is mentioned, Túrin is only mentioned one other time in the whole of the Lord of the Rings, and it is again alongside Beren when Sam is slaying Shelob, right? We get that moment where Shelob drives her weight down upon Sam as he is beneath her pocked and ancient scarred carapace, right? And in so doing, because evil is self-destructive, TM, she drives herself down on Sam and therefore plunges herself down onto Sting, and that slays her. That is where we get that reference. Where are we? The blade scored it with a dreadful gash, but those hideous folds could not be pierced by the strength of man, not though elf or dwarf should forge the steel, or the hand of Beren or of Túrin wield it. So again, kind of crediting Túrin there as one of the greatest warriors of the ancient world. Okay, so I foreshadowed the great Hunthor. Let's see if he makes it through this slide. Then Nienor, being unable to endure her fear and unwilling to wait in the Ethel, tidings of Turambar's fortune sent forth after him, and a great company went with her. At this Brandir was filled with all the more with dread, and he sought to dissuade her and the people that would go with her from this rashness, but they heeded him not. Therefore he renounced his lordship, and all love for the people that had scorned him, and having naught left but his love for Nienor, he girt himself with a sword and went after her, but being lame he fell far behind. Now Turambar came to Nin Gerith at sundown, and there he learned that Glaurung lay on the brink of the high shores of Teiglin, and he was like to move when night fell. Then he called those tidings good, for the dragon lay at Cabin and Aras, where the river ran in a deep and narrow gorge that a hunted deer might overleap, and Turambar thought that he would seek no further, and would attempt to pass over the gorge. Therefore he purposed to creep down at dusk and descend into the ravine under night, and cross over the wild water, and then to climb up the further cliff, and so come to the dragon beneath his guard. This counsel he took, but the heart of Dorlas failed when they came to the races of Teiglin in the dark, and he dared not attempt the perilous crossing, but drew back and lurked in the woods, burdened with shame. Turambar and Hunthor nonetheless crossed over in safety, for the loud roaring of the water drowned all other sounds, and Glaurung slept. But ere the middle night the dragon roused, and with a great noise and blast cast his forward part across the chasm, and began to draw his bulk after. Turambar and Hunthor were well nigh overcome by the heat and the stench, and they sought in haste for a way up to come at Glaurung. And Hunthor was slain by a great stone that was dislodged from on high by the passage of the dragon, and smote him on the head and cast him into the river. So he ended of the house of Haleth not the least valiant. Fairly well, Hunthor. 4 named mentions in this entire book, all in this chapter, 3 of them on this slide. I'm also moved, stirred, fascinated by, amused by this moment with Dorlas, right? Who in previous slides has upbraided Túrin and then and then upbraided Brandir too, and in fact the people of Ethel Brandir, and now his heart fails him, right? We're getting this interesting kind of almost a twist of satire here, right? The guy who speaks most volubly and most publicly about the need of heroism, the guy who is the first to shout that people aren't doing what they need to do to save the day, well, his heart fails him in the moment. He can't do it. He cannot cross the races of Teiglin in the dark. He dared not attempt the perilous crossing, but drew back and lurked in the wood, burdened with shame. So we have Dorlas falling by the wayside here. We kind of have Brandir falling by the wayside here, right? Because he is lame, he is club-footed. So he is setting off in pursuit of Nienor, girts himself with a sword and goes after her, but of course doesn't keep up the pace as he's falling here for powerful narrative purpose when we get to that. I wanted to pause here and talk a little about the geography, but we must move on. We absolutely must move on. So Hunthor has died. Dorlas has left, waiting in the shadow of the wood, filled with shame. The important thing is that Túrin Turambar is by himself. Then Turambar summoned all his will and courage and climbed the cliff alone and came beneath the dragon. Then he saw Gurthang, and with all the might of his arm and of his hate, he thrust it into the... Sorry. Then he drew Gurthang, and with all the might of his arm and of his hate, he thrust it into the soft belly of the worm, even up to the hilts. But when Glaurung felt his death pang, he screamed, and in his dreadful throe he heaved up his bulk and hurled himself across the chasm, and there lay lashing and coiling in his agony. And he set all in a blaze about him and beat all to ruin until at last his fires died, and he lay still. Now Gurthang had been wrested from Turambar's hand in the throw of Glaurung, and it clave to the belly of the dragon. Turambar therefore crossed the water once more, desiring to recover his sword and to look upon his foe. And he found him stretched at his length and rolled upon one side, and the hilts of Gurthang stood in his belly. Then Turambar seized the hilts and set his foot upon the belly, and cried in mockery of the dragon and his words at Nargothrond, "Hail, worm of Morgoth, well met again! Die now, and the darkness have thee. Thus is Túrin, son of Húrin, avenged." Then he wrenched out the sword, and a spout of black blood followed it, and fell in his hand, and the venom burned it. And thereupon Glaurung opened his eyes, and looked upon Turambar with such malice that it smote him as a blow. And by that stroke, and the anguish of the venom, he fell into a dark swoon, and lay as one dead, and his sword was beneath him. And if Túrin made the right choice leaving Ethelbrandir, if he made the right choice to approach Glaurung by stealth, by trickery, by treachery, if he made the right choice to undertake this daring traversal of the chasm here in order to slay Glaurung with a single blow to his sensitive underside, again, echoes of Smaug here, if all of those things were smart, then he ran out of smartness. He absolutely drained that barrel dry, because everything that now happens springs from Túrin's desire to, well, recover Gurthang that was Anglachel, right? Absolutely. To go get his black sword back. Yes, but further from Túrin's pride. This is the point at which we turn to a more classic kind of Greco-Roman tragic structure. This is less the baleful influence of Morgoth. This is less the actual active malevolence of one of the greats of Arda, and more a series of events that flows forth from this moment of flaw, this manifestation of that thing which lays Túrin open to this tragedy in the first place, right? As Turambar crosses and draws out the sword, he goes to get his sword back, and not just to draw out his sword, but he sets his foot upon the belly of the dragon and cries in mockery, "Hail, worm of Morgoth, well met again, die now in the darkness have thee, thus is Túrin, son of Húrin, avenged." Then he wrenched out the sword, and a spout of black blood followed it and fell on his hand, and the venom burned it. And in that moment, Glaurung opens his eyes, and unprotected, Túrin is struck by it. He's struck by the full power of the dragon's gaze, and falls into this stupor, falls into a dark swoon, and lay as one dead, and his sword was beneath him. Why is it important that his sword is beneath him? It's important that the sword is not visible to people who might come by. It isn't at all clear what has happened. Let's move now into what is inevitable, right? I think that in that moment we can sense the end of this story, and that's partly how tragedies differ from other modes of storytelling. Tragedies gain a lot of their narrative power not through surprise, not through twists, not through revelation, but through this procession of inevitability. You know what is going to happen. You sense what is going to happen. In a well-ordered tragedy, even if you don't know the story, even if you don't know exactly what is coming or how it is going to play out, you know that something bad is coming and that it is drawing closer with every word, with every line, with every paragraph, right? You know that it is coming to claim your hero. And I think we feel that now, even if we don't know exactly what is coming. But of course, we do kind of know exactly what is coming because we read other tragedies. We know how this is going to play out. And it plays out here very quickly. It's so swift. The resolution of this story here in this moment of crisis is just so immediate. So this is, as we get to, as we'll note in a moment, I'll delve into it after I read the slide, but this is our moment of anagnorisis, right? This is our moment of revelation. This is the Aristotelian moment where the sudden understanding comes upon the protagonist, or in this case, our secondary protagonist, and everything comes undone all at once. The screams of Glaurung rang in the woods and came to the people that waited at Nen Girith. And when those that looked forth heard them and saw afar the ruin and burning that the dragon made, they deemed that he had triumphed and was destroying those that had assailed him. And Niniel sat and shuddered beside the falling water. And at the voice of Glaurung, her darkness crept upon her again, so that she could not stir from that place of her own will. Even so Brandir found her, for he came to Nengirith at last, limping wearily, and when he heard that the dragon had crossed the river and had beaten down his foes, his heart yearned toward Niniel in pity. Yet he thought also, Turambar is dead, but Niniel lives. Now it may be that she will come with me, and I will lead her away, and so we shall escape from the dragon together. After a while, therefore, he stood by Niniel and he said, Come, it is time to go. If you will, I will lead you. And he took her hand, and she arose silently and followed him, and in the darkness none saw them go. But as they went down the path to the crossings, and the moon rose and cast a grey light on the land, and Niniel said, Is this the way? And Brandir answered that he knew no way save to flee as they might from Glaurung and escape into the wild. But Niniel said, The black sword was my beloved and my husband. To seek him only do I go. What else could you think? And she sped on before him. Thus she came toward the crossings of Teiglin and beheld how Thenelith in the white moonlight, and great dread came on her. Then with a cry she turned away, casting off her cloak, and fled southward along the river, and her white raiment shone in the moon. And if I was crediting Brandir with a certain selflessness, a certain wisdom, a kind of Gwyndorian aspect, right? If I'm crediting Brandir with the spirit of Gwyndor earlier in this week's reading, it's kind of fallen away now. I mean, we can understand, I think, a little bit, but that is to say, we can understand his desire, right? Turambar is dead, but Niniel lives. Now it may be that she will come with me, and I will lead her away, and so we shall escape from the dragon together, right? He believes that the battle is lost, but there is still hope for survival, and he loves her. So why wouldn't he want her with him in the absence of her husband? Come, it is time to go. If you will, I will lead you. And so he leads her, because she also is in this swoon. She also is in this like half stupor. She is in this fugue state in this moment. But as he leads her away, she rejects it entirely. The black sword was my beloved and my husband. To seek him only do I go. What else could you think? There's no other than this. There's no escaping from this. It doesn't matter. If he has fallen, then I have fallen too. There's a kind of, explicitly, right? A poetic grandeur to this. We're thinking of these old sagas. We're thinking of these old stories. The power of this connection is true. It is emphasized by the text in a way that I think actually works as a rather beautiful counterpoint to what is, a tragic incest story, right? It's bad that Turambar and Niniel are husband and wife. It's bad that she is pregnant. This probably ought not to be, right? We haven't really touched on incest taboos among the Edain, but we know that the elves have them, and if the elves have them, the men should probably have them too, just in case they don't already. And clearly they do, right? That's part of the functional operative tragedy of Túrin and of the Children of Húrin, right? Again, thus the name. But what we're emphasizing here is that there is goodness here. There is goodness, even then, is kind of a loaded word. Maybe not goodness, but there is a purity. There is a principle. There is something very powerful here that is stirring Niniel in this moment. No, Turambar is the guy that I pledged my fealty to. He's the guy that I pledged my life to. He is my husband, so I am going to go and be with him. Escaping from the dragon is not important. That's why I'm here, in fact. Did I ever tell... Well, I guess she can't tell him about the time that she fled Doriath in the footsteps of her mother to try and find her brother, because she doesn't remember that. But we're certainly seeing a recapitulation of that exact experience here, right? She flees from safety into danger, pursuing again that person whom she loves. And in both cases, actually, that person that she believes to be the only person in the world who is her kin, right? First her mother, in the absence of her brother, and now her husband brother in the absence of her mother, right? Who she no longer remembers. So we have this moment, and it's a moment of sweetness and of complexity, but it's also, most importantly perhaps, returning a kind of agency to Niniel. We are seeing here a kind of capacity for choice, even in this stupor from which she has arisen, right? As Brandir comes and leads her away, and she's like, this is not, we're not going to the dragon though, right? Because we should be, because that's where my husband is. And he says, no, well, I thought maybe, we'd go to a I'd get you a nice pasta dinner is what I was thinking. No, she wants to go where she wants to go. She wants to go where she belongs. That is what is driving her consistently, Nienor and Niniel together, all through the arc of this story. So again, we're left with this understanding that though Tolkien spends little time on his female characters, these female characters are generally complex and interesting and principled and capable, right? Again and again and again through the Silmarillion, we see these female characters stepping up and being, in some senses, the most interesting part of the story. Is Nienor the most interesting part of the Túrin story? Maybe not singularly, but are Morwen and Nienor the most interesting part of the Túrin story? Like maybe, actually, like maybe. I'm fascinated. Is Brotha's wife the most interesting part of the story in Dorlas? Absolutely, right? This kinswoman of I'm referring to Erin or Iron, as I was kind of mispronouncing her name earlier. Erin, probably. Is she the most interesting thing that happens in Dorlas? Maybe. There's a whole story thread here that's just under the surface or just happening in the periphery, just happening close to the margin here that is, I think, genuinely fascinating. And the care with which Tolkien crafts this, not just to complement and to serve and to illustrate Túrin's story, but to create real tension and sophistication and empathy in the part of the reader, I think is phenomenally done. Let's keep pushing on here. Because again, things are just going to unfold, right? Thus Brandir saw her from the hillside and turned to cross her path, and he was still behind her when she came to the ruin of Glaurung nigh the brink of Cabin and Aras. Then she saw the dragon lying, but she heeded him not, for a man lay beside him, and she ran to Turambar and called his name in vain. Then finding that his hand was burned, she washed it with tears and bound it about with a strip of her raiment, and she kissed him and cried on him again to awake. Thereat Glaurung stirred for the last time ere he died, and he spoke with his last breath, saying, "Here, Nienor, daughter of Húrin, we meet again ere the end. I give thee joy that thou hast found thy brother at last, and now thou shalt know him, a stabber in the dark, treacherous to foes, faithless to friends, and Túrin, son of Húrin. But the worst of all his deeds thou shalt feel in thyself." Then Glaurung died, and the veil of his malice was taken from her, and she remembered all the days of her life. Looking down upon Túrin, she cried, "Farewell, O twice beloved, a Túrin Turambar Túrin Umbertanen, master of doom by doom mastered, O happy to be dead." Then Brandir, who had heard all, standing stricken upon the edge of ruin, hastened toward her, but she ran from him, distraught with horror and anguish, and coming to the brink of Cabed and Aras, she cast herself over and was lost in the wild water. Then Brandir came and looked down and turned away in horror, and though he no longer desired life, he could not seek death in that roaring water. And thereafter no man looked again upon Cabed and Aras, nor would any beast or bird come there, nor any tree grow. And it was named Cabed Nedemarth, the leap of dreadful doom. And that's the end of Nienor. The moment of anagnorisis really hitting here. I split that moment between the last slide and this because it is clear that something comes to her when she recognizes the mound of the elf maiden, right? When she recognizes this familiar place, when she recognizes the place that Túrin first found her, this place of her first memory, right? You'll remember that after she is taught language once more, after she is healed by Brandir in Ethelbrandir, that she doesn't remember anything before that moment. It is being discovered by Túrin that is her first and most enduring memory through these 3 years that she has now spent. But the worst of all his deeds thou shalt feel in thyself. Again, we called this out when Glaurung was holding Túrin at Nargothrond, right? That he gives him this accounting of his sins, which is actually pretty accurate, right? Usurper of power, all of this, this kind of account of what Túrin has done wrong. And again, we get a version of it here, a stabber in the dark, treacherous to foes, faithless to friends, and a curse unto his kin. All technically correct, all absolutely correct, right? A stabber in the dark. Well, he just, yes, absolutely did that to Glaurung. Treacherous to foes? Absolutely. He's a dangerous warrior. Faithless to friends? Yeah. I mean, we're not just thinking about Beleg Strongbow here, though we could be for sure. But I mean, Brandir himself, right, is right there. He has been overtaken. He has not been supported by Túrin. Túrin has usurped him, like very literally. Faithless to friends, absolutely. And a curse unto his kin. I mean, literally true. Túrin, son of Húrin, but the worst of all his deeds thou shalt feel in thyself. It is the baby within you, Nienor, that is the worst thing of all the many sins that Túrin has committed. But look at what happens. She isn't transformed completely by this revelation, right? Glaurung died and the veil of his malice was taken from her, and she remembers all the days of her life. Suddenly she has this memory. Now we must remember, she has never met Túrin before, right? He departed from Dorloman before she was born. So they have no familiarity, the one with the other, which is of course why he doesn't recognize her naturally. He doesn't look at her and think, wow, you look a lot like a younger female me. But here, nonetheless, she is suddenly burdened with this complete cognizance of what has happened, of the complete tragedy. This is the moment, the completion of the anagnorisis, right? This is her moment of revelation, and she doesn't betray any of the feelings that she has had through the course of the story. Farewell, O twice beloved. She is grieving him as a brother and as a husband, and both of those feelings are kind of true and present. She can't live with them. She can't endure them. She cannot bear them. This cannot continue. But nonetheless, in this moment, she doesn't reject or repudiate either of the sets of feelings that she has. She acknowledges him immediately, both as brother and as husband. A Túrin Turambar Túrin Ambartanan, master of doom, by doom mastered. Calling out the deep and profound irony of Túrin's most tragic name, right? Oh, happy to be dead. Again, happy, lucky here in the form, right? She's looking down upon his body, believing that he has already died, and presumably believing that he died before he knew her true identity. Thus, oh, happy to be dead. It's a good thing that he's dead. It's a good thing that he never found this out. Brandir is there, of course, hastens toward her, but club-footed as he is, cannot catch her as she casts herself down into the water. And Brandir, the counterpoint here I find so interesting, that Brandir cannot take the same step himself, I find fascinating, because I'm inclined to read this as a textual acknowledgement of the strength of Nienor. Oh, I'm getting perilously close to making my final kind of argument about the story of Túrin Turambar here. Is this the time? No, you know what? Let's do quickly a couple. Well, we've got to get to the end of Túrin Turambar. We've got 5 more slides in the evening, and then I really want to make my argument about how to read Túrin Turambar in the context of the Legendarium as it stands. But Brandir made his way back to Nengirith to bring tidings to the people, and he met Dorlas in the woods and slew him, the first blood that ever he had spilled, and the last. And he came to Nengirith, and men cried to him, "Have you seen her? For Niniel is gone." And he answered, "Niniel is gone forever. The dragon is dead, and Turambar is dead, and those tidings are good." The people murmured at these words, saying that he was crazed, but Brandir said, "Hear me to the end. Niniel the beloved is also dead. She cast herself into Teiglin, desiring life no more, for she learned that she was none other than Nienor, daughter of Húrin of Dorloman, ere her forgetfulness came upon her, and that Turambar was her brother, Túrin, son of Húrin." You can almost feel the Greek chorus moment here, right? You can almost feel the culmination of the staged Greek tragedy version of the story of Turambar as the oracle comes forth to profess to the audience, and lo, here is what is unfolded. We get this version of Brandir here. Brandir slaying Dorlas in the woods. The urgency of his grief. Again, we are not asked to side with Brandir. We are not asked to praise him or to forgive him or to excuse him in this act of violence, right? But we are given complexity. We are given the depth of hurt, the immediacy of hurt and heartache here. I said before that one of the things that makes this story different, as I have defended Tolkien previously, one of the criticisms of Professor Tolkien is that his characters don't have emotional depth, and the good guys are good and the bad guys are bad, and it's that simple. And that, as I've said many times, is obviously and trivially and casually not the case. Have you read the book? Any of the books, in fact. But what we see in the story of Túrin is, I think, an even further allowance made for grief and emotional complexity and emotional immediacy, and we see that here from Brandir. Niniel is gone forever, the dragon is dead, and Turambar is dead, and those tidings are good. It is in fact good that both the dragon and Turambar are dead. There is a tragedy, though, and it is that Niniel is dead, and it is a tragedy because she desired life no more. She learned this awful secret. But even as he ceased and the people wept, Túrin himself came before them. For when the dragon died, his swoon left him, and he fell into a deep sleep of weariness. But the cold of the night troubled him, and the hilts of Gurthang drove into his side, and he awoke. Then he saw that one had tended his hand, and he wondered how much he was left none the less to lie upon the cold ground. And he called, and hearing no answer, he went in search of aid, for he was weary and sick. But when the people saw him, they drew back in fear, thinking that it was his unquiet spirit. And he said, Nay, be glad, for the dragon is dead, and I live. But wherefore have you scorned my counsel and come into peril? And where is Nienor? For her I would see, and surely you did not bring her from home. Then Brandir told him that it was so, and Nienor was dead. But the wife of Dorlas cried out, Nay, Lord, he is crazed, for he came here saying that you were dead, and he called it good tidings, but you live. Then Turambar was wrathful, and believed that all Brandir said or did was done in malice towards himself and Nienor, begrudging their love, and he spoke evilly to Brandir, calling him Clubfoot. Then Brandir reported all that he had heard, and named Nienor, daughter of Húrin, and he cried out upon Turambar with the last words of Glaurung, that he was a curse unto his kin, and to all that harboured him. The motivation of the not even the motivation, right? The motivation is fairly transparent. The inclusion of the wife of Dorlas is so great and is again such a beat of like classic Greek tragedy. I just love that in his pain and his grief and his wrath and his desire to pin the blame anywhere at all, Dorlas is slain, and then his wife comes forth to say, actually, you know what, Brandir is the one to blame. He came in here crazed, saying that you were dead and it was good tidings. Just to trigger this last awful twist of what happens. We must progress. It's 10:42, and I'm running out of time and must get through the end of this. Then Turambar fell into a fury, for in those words he heard the feet of the doom overtaking him, and he charged Brandir with leading Nienor to her death, and publishing with delight the lies of Glaurung, if indeed he devised them not himself. Then he cursed Brandir and slew him, and he fled from the people into the woods. But after a while his madness left him, and he came to Houth and Aleth, and there sat and pondered all his deeds. And he cried upon Finduilas to bring him counsel, for he knew not whether he would do now more ill to go back to Doriath to seek his kin, or to forsake them forever and seek death in battle. And even as he sat there, Mablung with a company of grey elves came over the crossings of Teiglin, and he knew Túrin, and hailed him, and he was glad indeed to find him yet living, for he had learned of the coming forth of Glaurung, and that his path led to Brethil, and also he had heard report that the black sword of Nargothrond now dwelt there. Therefore he came to give warning to Túrin, and help if need be. But Túrin said, You came too late. The dragon is dead. Then they marveled and gave him great praise, but he cared nothing for it, and said, This only I ask, give me news of my kin, for in Dorloman I learned that they had gone to the hidden kingdom. The madness that accompanies these moments of anagnorisis, these moments of revelation, the coming of the truth, so often we find our tragic heroes stricken with a moment of a kind of inconsolable fury sometimes, but oftentimes just a disordered thought, right? As they reach this moment of crisis, there's a sense here that he already knows or already suspects, right? That even in this moment, he's not feeling. Then they marveled and gave him great praise, but he cared nothing for it. No, because as we know, Túrin doesn't care for praise or fame of any kind, really. Not a prideful man, Túrin Turambar. Let's get right to it. I want to. There are so many wrap-up thoughts, but the problem is that in order to get to our wrap-up thoughts, we have to wrap up. 2 more slides. Then Mablung was dismayed, but needs must tell to Túrin how Morwen was lost and Nienor cast into a spell of dumb forgetfulness, and how she escaped him upon the borders of Doriath and fled northwards. Then at last Túrin knew that doom had overtaken him, and that he had slain Brandir unjustly, so that the words of Glaurung were fulfilled in him. And he laughed as one fey, crying, This is a bitter jest indeed. But he bade Mablung go and return to Doriath with curses upon it. And a curse too upon your errand, he cried. This only was wanting. Now comes the night. Then he fled from them like the wind, and they were amazed, wondering what madness had seized him, and they followed after him. But Túrin far outran them, and he came to Cabed-Inaris, and heard the roaring of the water, and saw all the leaves fall sere the trees, as though winter had come. There he drew forth his sword, that now alone remained to him of all his possessions, and he said, Hail, Gurthang! No lord or loyalty dost thou know, save the hand that wieldeth thee. From no blood wilt thou shrink. Wilt thou therefore take Túrin Turambar? Wilt thou slay me swiftly? And from the blade rang a cold voice in answer. Yea, I will drink thy blood gladly, that I may forget the blood of Balig my master, and the blood of Brandir slain unjustly. I will slay thee swiftly. Then Túrin set the hilts upon the ground, and cast himself upon the point of Gurthang, and the black blade took his life. But Mablung and the elves came and looked on the shape of Glaurung lying dead and upon the body of Túrin, and they grieved. And when men of Brethil came thither, they had learned the reasons for Túrin's madness and death. They were aghast, and Mablung said bitterly, I also have been meshed in the doom of the children of Húrin, and thus with my tidings have slain one that I loved. And thus, the death, the end of Túrin Turambar. And one of the strangest moments in, I think, the entire book. I think... and yet a moment that is not so strange in its passing. It is curious, obviously, as we pointed toward last week, that Anglachel, now Gurthang, the sword reforged, speaks. It speaks directly to Túrin. And I think that it is very tempting in this moment to assume that what is actually happening here is that Túrin is lost in his madness, right? That he is overtaken by, right? He laughs as one fey, that he's imagining this exchange, that he's imagining this recapitulation of his sins, this reckoning of his sins, right? Because that is what Gurthang says to him. Yea, I will drink thy blood gladly, so I may forget the blood of Beleg my master, and the blood of Brandir slain unjustly, I will slay thee swiftly. Like an accounting, a reckoning is being made. Yes, you killed, well, okay, honestly, like a lot of dudes, but also two dudes that you definitely should not have killed. You definitely should not have killed Beleg, and you definitely should not have killed Brandir just now. And of course, remembering too that Beleg, my master, well, Gurthang was not Beleg's sword. Anglachel was Beleg's sword, right? Taken from the armory of King Thingol, gifted from the armory of King Thingol, not to, in any way impugn the reputation of Beleg Strongbow. So I think it's easy on the one hand to assume that what is happening here is that Túrin is imagining it, that this is an abstraction, that this is a moment of madness that is taking him here at the very end of his life, overwhelmed by the awfulness of the tragedy and his own culpability in it too, right? That's what's so important. Then at last Túrin knew that doom had overtaken him and that he had slain Brandir unjustly. For the first time, we're not seeing Túrin do that little justification two-step. He's not trying to explain why it happened or to blame anyone else for it. He's just crushed under the weight of it. He laughed as one fey, crying, "This is a bitter jest indeed." So that is the end of Túrin Turambar. Let's get to the last slide here. Then they lifted up Túrin and found that Gurthang had broken asunder. But elves and men gathered there great store of wood, and they made a mighty burning, and the dragon was consumed to ashes. Túrin they laid in a high mound where he had fallen, and the shards of Gurthang were laid beside him. And when all was done, the elves sang a lament for the children of Húrin, and a great grey stone was set upon the mound, and thereon was carven in runes of Doriath, Túrin Turambar, Dagnir Glaurunga. And beneath they also wrote, Nienor, Niniel. But she was not there, nor was it ever known whither the cold waters of Teiglin had taken her. The end of Túrin Turambar. Noted here, of course, Túrin Turambar, Dragonsbane, right? Slayer of Glaurung is what is carved upon his monument, which, yes, technically correct. A few other things we could have added to his unofficial biography there, but maybe it's best that we just limit ourselves to the slaying of Glaurung. But what is most interesting here? I'm debating on how exactly to approach this, because I find it such a fascinating thought, right? We have Túrin laid here in repose. The fragments of his sword, again, a shattered sword, right, set by him again. The monument raised, and beneath they wrote also Nienor Niniel, but she was not there, right? This person who has two names, this person who has two identities, she was not there, nor was it ever known whither the cold waters of Teiglin had taken her. Now, here's what's crucial about the Children of Húrin as a story and its position in Tolkien's cosmology, right? Its position vis-a-vis our understanding of how Arda is unfolding, of how the world was created and how the world will end and everything that happens in between. You're absolutely right that Nienor is not there, nor was it ever known whether the cold waters of Teiglin had taken her. Crucially, Túrin also is not there. Túrin's body is there, but his spirit has departed. Now, the elves don't know where, and we can assume that the men don't really know where either, right? As I mentioned last week, it's in the other versions of this story that Morgoth is actively taunting Húrin with the possibility that there is no life after death at all. And Húrin does not believe it. He is not swayed by Morgoth, but it seems as though he's primarily not swayed by Morgoth because it's Morgoth who is telling him this, and that maybe if he had heard this idea from another source, he might have been a little more credulous. It is a tragedy, of course, that these things unfold. It is a tragedy that Turambar and Nienor kind of have this connection and this short-lived awful romance, right? It's tragic that these figures end up dead, but we have to remember that in Tolkien's conception of the universe, in Tolkien's conception of the Legendarium, in Tolkien's conception of what it is to be a person in the world, this isn't the end. And that death isn't, as it's taken so often in real life religious perspectives, death is not a punishment. Death is not something that has happened because the world is flawed. Death is not something that happens because the world is rendered imperfect, because the world is marred. Death is always, and has always been, and will always be, the gift of Ilúvatar to the younger children, that men depart the world, that Morgoth's influence, no matter how malign, no matter how manifest, no matter how enormous in its magnitude, even if we credit everything that we could possibly credit to Morgoth in this unfolding story of Túrin Turambar, right? If we directly draw a line, if we have our big corkboard with our red thread linking every single tragic event in Túrin's life back to Morgoth directly, even if we picture Morgoth sitting on his iron throne in the depths of Angband, just like rubbing his hands together, watching his, I don't know what, CCTV footage of what is happening to Túrin as his life just collapses again and again and again, even if we credit all of it to Morgoth, it ends right now. He can't reach the younger children of Ilúvatar outside of the bounds of Arda. His power is limited. You remember there's that beat right in the Ainulindalë when, upon entering into the world, all of the Ainur will be locked to Arda, essentially, for its duration. You can't leave, right? You can come in after the fact, as Tukas did. God, it's been a few episodes since I had cause to mention Tukas, and I'm glad that I got the chance to mention him very unexpectedly tonight, right? Tukas came in after the fact because he heard the sounds of fighting in the Little Kingdom, right? But you can't leave. Your power is now bound to Arda for the entirety of its creation. When Arda comes to an end, then presumably you will be liberated again. You'll be free to return to the timeless halls of the Ainur, along with presumably the spirits of all of the children of Ilúvatar, elder and younger, and who knows, dwarven spirits too. They have their own stories about how these things will play out. But because of that, there is a hard limit on Morgoth's power over human beings. There is a hard limit on how much malice he can bear for Húrin. There is a hard limit on how much damage he can do, because in the end, like Nienor and like Nienor, as she's credited there at the end, we pass out of the story. We pass out of his control. And ultimately that is to the good, no matter what has happened in the course of our lives. Now, one thing that is absent largely in Tolkien's kind of cosmological schematic and his moral schematic is an idea of judgment, or is an idea of punishment for those who are evil. We don't know quite how that works because the elves don't know. And even, obviously the men of Middle-earth don't know either. We don't have great religious leaders in Middle-earth. No one is speculating about what the afterlife might be like, because Tolkien wants to maintain that consistency, that compatibility with his real life Catholic beliefs, right? He wants to maintain space for his... I'm hesitating here because I want to draw a little fence around what Tolkien believes first. Tolkien is so often described as being like an extremely faithful Catholic. Oh, God, even then, he was a very faithful Catholic. What he was not was a completely Orthodox Catholic. What he was not was a completely obedient Catholic. He had different ideas. Here in the secondary creation, here in the Legendarium, the idea that death is a gift stands at odds to Catholic teaching. The idea that death is the ultimate resolution is incompatible. So there are tensions there, and I wouldn't want to simplify out those tensions as we're trying to discuss these most high order ideas of all of Tolkien storytelling. I think what I want to do is wrap it up there. In fact, that is it. That is the last slide. It's not actually technically the last slide, but I'm going to shuffle ahead because I did pull the end of Húrin and Morwen to discuss, but I think we've done it. Yeah, we're almost at 2 hours. We'll discuss that in its proper place in Chapter 22 next week. Let me call up my slides. I'm just now realizing that these, the dates that I have here are entirely incorrect. So instead of calling up the slide, I will just tell you that next week on Thursday, the 12th of June, we will be covering chapters 22 and hopefully into 23 of the Quenta Silmarillion. And then on June 19th, also Thursday evening, 9 o'clock Central Time, we will be concluding the Quenta Silmarillion. Not quite the Silmarillion, but the Quenta Silmarillion will come to an end with the story of Eärendil, which is just a banger. I mean, we've basically got nothing but hits here through to the end of the Quenta. In fact, the Akalabaeth is so rich. It's a very different kind of story. And then, of course, the Rings of Power in the Third Age is fascinating. All of this is to say that good things are coming. We've probably got 4 weeks left, maybe 5. I might have to stretch this out just a little bit into 5 weeks. But either way, as I said at the beginning of the show, if we do 5 more weeks, that takes us to 26 episodes, which is a full half year spent covering the Silmarillion here on Stars and Swords, a show where I cover books in 4 or 5 weeks, generally speaking. We're not going to maintain that pace, I promise. Okay, that is going to do it for tonight. Guys, thank you so much for your company. Thank you so much for joining me. Glorfin David, Glad Rebecca, thank you for your brilliance here in the chat. It has been an absolute pleasure, as it always is. If you at home would like to support the show, you can head on over to patreon.com/nextword and pledge your support. You can help me make more podcasts. It's just, as I've said many times before, I am functionally a machine for taking your Patreon donations and turning them into hours of audio content. Had I my way, I would basically sit here and do this all the time, day in, day out, which is what's probably going to be necessary if I'm going to keep up with my podcasting commitments through to the end of the year. You can also, if you don't want to pledge your support financially right now, you can also head on over to the Patreon page, patreon.com/nextword. Just follow that along for free and you will get the links each week to the live sessions so you can come and hang out. That is it for the story of Túrin Turambar. I hope that we have ended on something of a lighter note. I hope that we have ended on something of peace, of I don't know, some kind of idea that this awful tragedy is perhaps not the end. And it certainly isn't the end of the story of the Quenta Silmarillion, as we will find out next week when, the rest of Beleriand falls apart. It's going to be tough, but we'll get through it together. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you all again next week. Till then, take care.